Hey guys, welcome back to Firegrinders episode 3. You were with us last time. We discussed your emergency fund, what its importance is, the factors you should look at in terms of where to hold it, how much it should be, what its purpose is, all of that. So if you haven't seen that, that's a very important consideration you should be looking over prior to investing. Go back and watch that episode. Tonight we're going to be talking about your debt position, which is the second big consideration you should have before launching into the investing road. So this for a lot of people is a very significant topic. So we're going to look at various aspects of it. We're going to look at it from the U.S. perspective. Sash has some really interesting insight into the international perspective as well, and some of his personal journey and how that's affected him and his business. So we're going to go down that road together. Welcome.
Yeah, welcome, guys. By the way, if you're joining us for the first time, my name is Sash, and this is my best friend in the whole wide world in finance, Sean. And so we are really, really excited that you joined us today. And we're going to jump right in. This is a very, very important topic, debt. And also something that a lot of us are going to experience or probably already experience right now. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can potentially address it, how we can manage it, and how we effectively can navigate it as investors.
It's a huge, huge topic for a lot of people in their financial situation. Debt is usually used by people to live beyond their means, or to afford things that are too large to purchase outright in cash. For too many people, I think it falls under the former, that people like to keep up with their neighbors, their friends, their social circle, and may not have the income to support the lifestyle they want to lead. So they lean on debt to help finance that. And it's not very long before they find themselves in over their heads and in this circumstance where they need to figure out a way out of it, because they get buried very quickly. So the reason it's important before you launch down the investing road is because it makes very little sense to invest if you have high interest debt. And the general recommendation I always make is before you get into investing, you need to make sure all of your high interest debt sources are gone. So we're going to cover that tonight. We're going to cover what high interest debt is, and a very specific strategy for how to tackle it and how it should work with other aspects of your financial plan.
Awesome. I'm really, really excited. I think this is one episode that you might also want to consider re-listening to or re-watching a couple times. You absolutely don't miss any of the important things that we talk about here. Again, this is not exhaustive, but we'll do our very best to cover this topic. Also, if you're listening to us on any of the podcast platforms, we are available both in audio and video formats. So if you would like to watch the video, you can check us out on the YouTube channel or on the Facebook channel. And you can also find us on all the major podcasting listings. Links will be in the show notes and description below. Awesome.
So let's start off with our personal experience with debt. Awesome. I know you have some really interesting insights in terms of how it's affected you on a personal level, on a business level. Mine is probably abbreviated, but I did struggle quite a bit with debt in my 20s. I met my wife when I had close to $15,000 in credit card debt. I was living the bachelor life, out there doing the thing, not paying attention to my savings, not paying attention to how I was living, and it just got beyond me. So I had a significant chunk of credit card debt that I then had to learn how to tackle, and that was the first challenge for me personally, was just figuring out how to get rid of this thing. So I tackled it following the strategy we're going to use tonight and cover tonight, but that's probably my most personal connection to debt, is just how quickly it can bury you.
So do you have any kind of like examples of what got you started down that path when you were younger? Just so like people who are maybe younger and potentially tempted in that situation can have some point of like context or relation.
Down the debt road?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was for me, it was turning away. And what I mean by that is just kind of ignoring the kicking the can down the road, I guess is the best way to say it. That if there was something that I didn't have cash for in my checking account, but I really wanted, if I wanted to go out with my buddies, or I wanted to buy a new video game, or I wanted to, buy some upgrade for my car or whatever, and I couldn't afford it, the easy solution was just to put it on a credit card and pay it off later. And the problem was I never came back to pay it off later, or I didn't come back to pay it off later enough. And that's how I got buried. But I was actually talking to one of my other buddies recently about this, and I'm sure most of you guys have heard of what's called the rule of 72. And basically, the way to understand the rule of 72 is you take your interest rate, and this is usually used for investing. You take your interest rate and you divide it into 72, and the number that you get will give you the number of years it takes your balance to double. So if you have, just to use clean numbers, if you have an interest rate on your investments of 7.2%, what that tells you is, not adding anything further, that investment will double in 10 years. So 72 divided by 7.2 is 10. And that gives you 10 years that it would take your investment to double. It's interesting when you flip it around and look at the debt side of it, though, because it works just as well. And if you have, let's say, an average APR of 24% on your credit card debt that you're carrying forward, it takes you just 3 years for that credit card debt to double. Insane. So think about that. Think about how quickly someone can get buried in those circumstances, and that's exactly why carrying high interest debt is just unbelievably damaging to your financial plan.
Sure, man. Absolutely. So in the US, of course, which is your context, what would you say is the average kind of interest rate that you're paying on credit cards there?
It's usually above 10%. If your credit rating is bad, if you miss payments, if you default on things, it goes. I think I actually had one at one point when I was struggling with things go up to 29.99%, which I think is probably some kind of legal limit. But think about that, dude. Close to 30%. I mean, that's just unbelievable. And yeah, I mean, you think about how quickly someone can get buried with that kind of debt around their neck, and it's just crazy. It's crazy to me that these things exist, that financial literacy isn't taught to our kids at a much earlier age, and effectively pointing them away from these things. We do use a credit card, my wife and I, we do use a credit card, but we make sure that we pay it off every month. And there's, contesting perspectives back and forth, whether you should use credit cards or not. We earn points for what we spend, and we figure if we're going to spend it and pay it off every month anyway, we can at least get a little bit of a bonus for spending the money.
Same here.
So
yeah,
I think if you're smart and you are disciplined enough not to get crazy with it, you can actually do, you can have some benefit from it. But
yeah. Sure. You mentioned a term, APR. What does that stand for? And how can people kind of understand that?
It's the annual percentage rate that you will pay on your debt is the easiest way to understand it.
So let's kind of like take a step back and just look at the whole banking system for a sec. Okay, so when we look at a bank, we imagine that, hey, they've got all this money. They were super rich. Where does all that money come from? Well, technically, when a bank, we call it liquidity, right? So when a bank is about to lend money out to people, they're actually not lending their own money out. They're lending other people's money out. And so that's where you get to earn interest. So if you go into a bank and you say, hey, I want to put some money down into into some kind of high yield account, that interest that you're earning, that free, quote unquote, free money that you're earning actually comes from somewhere. And the only way that you're able to earn money from a savings account or a fixed deposit or whatever it is by the bank lending your money out to other people in the form of loans and debt. And so those are obviously loans and credit cards primarily. And so they would take your money and they would lend it out at a higher interest rate. They obviously keep the larger percentage as profit, and you get a smaller percentage. And so when you're thinking as an investor, what you're earning is measured as APY, annual percentage yield. And so yield obviously means how much money you're earning. But if you're on the opposite side, if you're borrowing, if you're using credit card, if you're using loans, it's measured in APR, annual percentage rate. And so the rate at which you're borrowing typically is higher than the rate at which you're earning if you're an investor. And so that's something that's super important. If ever you see these words, APR, APY, on any account, always like remember APR stands for borrowed money, APY stands for earned money. And that's a really, really important distinction. I think people need to understand because it's so vital. So we'll get into all the numbers and technicalities later. But yeah, man, when you said like 29 up to 29%, that was like, oh my God.
It's crazy. Yeah, I know. It's unreal.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. That's actually very similar to South Africa. So what I noticed when I was a student in South Africa was that I actually was able to get a credit card without having a job. I could just go to the bank and get obviously a checking account and a student credit card. And so the bank actually allows this. And so I imagine that that this is as early as they would probably start, kind of targeting people really, really early on, and obviously increasing their earnings throughout the lifetime of that person. But what is it like? What is it like for you, Sean, in the United States? What age can people start getting into debt over there? And would you say that? And how do you feel about that?
Well, it's weird because I actually went through this when I was younger. It's actually thought of in some circles as kind of like a rite of passage, getting your first credit card, and you think about how crazy that is. Like the right for you to take on debt is thought of as a rite of passage, but it's a big problem here. You go on any college campus, at least when I was going to college, and you'd see people marketing their products out there. You'd see, them trying to sign you up for these various forms of debt, credit cards. I think they've since changed the legality of that. But it's very much a predatory process, in terms of how they approach you and how they get you started with it. And once you start down that road, it's really easy. Like I said, I fell victim to it myself, this thinking of, well, I can't technically afford this thing, but I really want it. So why don't I just put it on credit? It's a very easy hole to fall into. And then before you realize, it's years later, you're still carrying this debt. And you're like, you look back and you're like, this was a waste. I've paid how much money in interest over these years to finance that one thing that I just couldn't wait until I had enough budgeted for,
Sure, man.
One of the big ones that I remember was plasma TV, back when plasma TVs first came out.
I remember.
I went to Best Buy. Yeah, I went to Best Buy and I bought a 50-inch plasma TV, 50-inch flat screen TV for $2,300.
Oh my god!
And I paid for that thing for 3 years, dude. 3 years. And you can go now and buy a 50-inch flat screen TV for few $100, Walmart or something. And I think about that. I'm like, what a waste. I don't know how much I paid in interest in the thing. I'd like to, that'd be an interesting thought experiment to go back and figure out how much I actually paid for this TV, but a depressing thought experiment.
I mean, look, I obviously, we'll unpack our personal situations in more detail throughout this episode. But I remember, if I could relate one point to that, I remember spending large amounts like that in video games, man. Just like in-game content. I think when
that's a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we got started out in Star Wars: The Old Republic, which we mentioned by the way in episode 1, they were in-game.
Spoiler
purchases.
alert: we're nerds.
Absolutely, and we're not ashamed.
Exactly.
But in Star Wars: The Old Republic, this was like more than 10 years ago. There were in-game purchases. Of course, I didn't spend as much as I spent later on the mobile games. If you've been following my YouTube channel, you'll know that I started out as a gamer on Contest of Champions. And I spent a lot of money, thousands of dollars. And they all they all came from credit cards. And so it's very real. It's very real. Yeah. I've got students in high school that are in a similar situation. It's really, really scary. But look, all debt is not bad, and
it's not.
And we'll talk about the good side of debt and building credit in just a couple minutes. But let's just kind of like categorize debt, right? So we mentioned credit cards, Sean. What other kinds of debt are there?
There's various forms. Credit card debt is obviously probably the most corrosive, the most threatening to people. But you go on down the line. There's personal loans. There's auto loans. You have a mortgage loan. You look at the various aspects that you have in your own situation and the various forms of debt that you take on, and there's any number of things you could see. Not all of these forms, like you said, are bad forms of debt. Not all of them are high interest debt. And the things we're really going to focus on knocking down before you get into investing are what I quantify as high interest debt. Generally speaking, I think of high interest debt as anything over 5%. Anything above a 5% APR, like you were talking about earlier, is those are the things you really want to focus on knocking down before you get into investing. And the reason that it doesn't, well, you should, is it doesn't make sense from a math perspective. The average rate of stock returns for the last, I think, probably close to 100 years is about 10%. So if you knock the average rate of inflation off of that, you're looking at 7%. If you're making, so here's the way I like to think about it. If you have credit card debt, let's say your APR is 15%, you can expect an after inflation rate of return of 7%. Does it really make sense to be investing money knowing you're going to get a 7% real return if you're paying 15% on the other end to a credit card? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you're actually losing
bleeding money out.
Yeah,
you're losing money. So your wiser use of money is to pay down that high interest debt, to get rid of it. And then once you get to a place where your debt forms are at least a lower interest rate, you can get into investing and actually starting to build wealth. But from a math perspective, it doesn't really make sense, you know?
Yeah, Roger. Okay, so we've established that debt can completely wreck you, but we've also kind of established that some debt is pretty good debt. Let's just address that, because I'm sure that we have investors listening to this who probably invest in real estate, and of course, the best way to get into that is if you have a credit score. So let's kind of address this whole idea of credit score. Let's talk about some good forms of debt, and then we'll unpack our personal experiences. I've also got a crazy couple of stories to share from my context here in the UAE, but let's just kind of cover that for a sec, and then we'll double back.
Sounds good. So yeah, like you said, there's various forms of debt that I would consider good forms of debt. The two main ones that come to mind are student loans to finance your education and your future earning potential, and mortgage loan. And those are the two that that stand out to me as productive debt for various reasons. But yeah, the ones that are destructive are obviously your credit cards. Auto loans actually can be destructive depending on what kind of loan structure you're looking at. That's a very interesting one. We could spend a whole episode talking about auto loans. I have a buddy that does car loans, and he was telling me they're starting to finance cars for these ridiculously long terms. I'm talking 8 to 10 years.
Oh my gosh.
And my whole thing is, if your only avenue to afford a car is paying for it over 10 years, you can't afford that car.
No chance.
So yeah, but yeah, those are the ones that I generally think of as productive debt. What's your view, Sash?
Okay, I have a couple of views here. So, so I think that debt is really important to get a credit record, a credit score. Okay, so let's assume that I'm thinking like an investor, and I want to buy assets that are pretty expensive, but also have the potential to go up in value over time. So let's say real estate, right? I want to start buying office apartments, maybe office blocks, and then maybe residential property, right? So obviously those are very, very high cost purchases. Most of the time it's wiser to get the bank to finance that, have the tenants pay that mortgage. The only way for me to even get access to bank loans is to obviously have a credit record. Right. And so really early on, I learned that I needed to have a credit record. And so, I started my first credit card in university. And also I needed to have some like very, very low end, I don't know if you guys have this in the United States, but like in certain retail stores, you can have accounts set up. So you don't have to actually pay for the item in cash. You can just like pay it over time. And the only reason that I did that was not because I couldn't afford it, but it was because I wanted to build this credit score. So even though I have not used any of my available credit right now in this particular context. In South Africa, I have like almost a perfect credit score, like almost the highest that you can get. I think the highest is like 730, and I'm like at 702 or something like that. So
nice.
So if I wanted to go and buy a property, if I wanted to buy a high end purchase, they would just need to look at my income, and then I have access to that because of my credit history. And so that's it's a very powerful place to be if you want to become an investor holding physical assets that are high and that have a high initial cost that you might not be able to afford for cash. But let's kind of like talk about some of the dark, the dark and
let's
terrible.
get deep.
Okay, so just like you, Sean, I love cars. I'm a huge car nerd. I love sports cars, especially high performance. I'm a huge, Fast and Furious fan.
Yeah.
And so really early on in South Africa, I got a 350Z when I just started working, and I wanted
that was my bachelor car, 350Z convertible.
Yeah, and I wanted to like do the whole twin turbo modification and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And but here's the thing: I bought that car on debt, and you asked what my position is, and now that I am more educated, I realized that was a mistake. So let me qualify this. So. I suppose my moment of enlightenment was when I read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, which is the book that, by the way, if you haven't read it, it's probably one of the most influential business books on that has ever been written. It's by a guy called Robert Kiyosaki. Very, very popular, very, very influential. Again, also very controversial in many ways. But Rich Dad, Poor Dad is a story. It's very much a fictional story, but the principles taught in the book are very, very important. So he positions himself as this character having two fathers, one of whom is his real father, and the other is his friend's father. So his friend's father is this wealthy entrepreneur. His real father is the academic, the person who is very pro-education, very pro-career, make sure you work this job for the rest of your life. It's very much the traditional approach to living and building a career over time. And so he does this comparison between the two, and he says, and this is where we might have a little bit of a debate. I'd love to get your ideas on this. He says he kind of opens up the book by explaining how your house is not an asset. And then he goes on to explain the difference between assets and liabilities. And when I learned this principle, and I'll unpack it in just a sec, it totally blew my mind. It totally blew my mind. And so an asset, he says, is something that puts money in your pocket. It generates some kind of return, and most importantly, it holds its value and it potentially increases its value over time. And so when I look at my experience with sports cars, of course, I did eventually buy many more sports cars after that. A, I used debt. B, those cars dropped in value.
Yeah.
And C, they did not generate any kind of return besides my unbridled pleasure when I drove them. I mean, but like, so I realized that I spent all this money and paid for it with interest over all these years. But in the end, it was a very bad investment decision because.
But did you look at it as an investment decision?
Well, nowadays I look at everything as an investment decision.
So here's the interesting thing, because I agree with you, and you could drive yourself crazy with this concept, but there's a concept called opportunity cost.
Right.
And basically what that is, for those that don't know, I know but for those that don't know, is if you were to take, let's say you're thinking about buying a new car, you're thinking about buying a $20,000 car, and you look at, it's going to mean, $300 a month car payments or whatever it works out to. You could take those numbers and you can plug those into a projection of what you'd earn if you were to just take that money and invest it, right? If you took those if you say it's $300 a month car payment, what if you took that $300 and instead of buying a new car, you put it into some kind of investment, whatever that investment is? Where would that money be down the road in 10, 20, 30 years? And chances are it will have grown exponentially.
Absolutely.
That money, when you look at it that way, that's called an opportunity cost, that
Absolutely.
You're taking that money per month, you're going to finance a new car, or you could take it and put it into something that's more productive for you. But here's the thing, you could drive yourself crazy with the concept. You could look at your $4 cup of coffee that you get every day and see the opportunity cost down the road if you were to invest that money. And you could drive yourself crazy looking at that and breaking down the minutia of every budgeting decision. Everything. If we saved $4 at the grocery store today and I invested that money, you could drive yourself nuts. It's only useful to a point, but
sure.
But yeah.
But I think that's where, so in the previous episode, we addressed budget, we touched on it a little bit, and we'll probably do an episode dedicated to budgeting. But I think that's where the budget really comes in, right? So you absolutely know your numbers and you know how much you're willing to set aside for each category, both expenses and investing. And so once you are able to quantify that, then you kind of can manage that whole that craziness associated with every single expense, because you've budgeted it for it. And so you know that this is my budget for eating out. This is my budget for groceries. This is my budget for this and this and this. And this is my budget for investing, right? Yeah. So I think the budgeting was probably the answer to that problem. So this idea of liabilities and assets. And so the same thing is what I would say I have now applied to my living condition. So I rent right now, and I can actually afford a house. I can afford a house, but I choose to rent for now because I personally want to be in a position where I will be able to pay for that house in cash, and of course, I probably won't tie up all that money in a mortgage, but I want to at any point be able to completely flatten that house loan or that home loan if I am ever caught flat-footed. And the same applies to vehicles now. I want to be able to afford 2, 3, 5, 10 of those vehicles for cash before I decide I'm going to go ahead and make this auto loan or this payment, because at any time that the proverbial shit hits the fan, I want to be able to flatten that loan instantly. I really want to make big purchase decisions right now if I know that at any time I need to completely settle that loan, even if I'm only like a couple months in, even though my mortgage might be like 5-10 years, whatever. I want to be able to be in a position where I can completely pay that off. And I realize not many people are in that position. Not many people might ever be in that position.
Right.
And so that's I suppose in a way that's one of the reasons why I'm really so passionate about this content that we're doing, so that we can potentially try to unpack some of the strategies that you can get into that situation, that position. And so that's just my view, right? What do you think about that? How would you respond to?
I think there's definitely an argument to be made in that way, that when you look at a home and all the costs that come with it, that it could be considered a liability in a lot of ways. You don't just you are paying into something, meaning that you do accrue equity as you go. But it also, once you pay the home loan off, it's still a continuing money drain on you, meaning you pay your property taxes, you pay your homeowner's insurance, you pay for these things that are a continual drain. You do have equity in your home, you do own something, and you do have something that you could, if worse came to worse, you could take to the bank, so to speak. But there definitely is an argument to be made that it is a money drain. So, I can see both sides of it. I definitely can. I see the other side that says, if you're going to be paying money every month for housing, why not put that into something that you own, that you can build some kind of equity in? Sure. But I also see the other side of it, that once you get to a certain point, it can be a money drain. We've had to replace our air conditioner here. People have to replace roofs. You have pretty big expenses that come up every once in a while, and it is expensive. Owning a home is expensive.
Absolutely.
So,
and that's why
I do miss that.
Yeah, that's why we covered the first episode, having that emergency fund in place, because you need to have money in place to pay for that. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say, I miss that about renting, being able to call someone up and be like, hey, this broke. It's your problem.
Absolutely.
Right now, it's like it's got to the point where we had a big problem with leaks about 3 years ago. Right. We were chasing this leak through our home for quite a while. We eventually figured out what it was, but I don't know. It's like some PTSD thing after that. Every time we get a heavy thunderstorm coming through, I'm like watching the ceiling for bubbling. I'm looking around. I'm like, when's it going to pop through? Is this going to cause an issue? But yeah, I don't know. I think you could look at it both ways for sure. I understand both approaches to it.
Absolutely. Since you and I are both obviously dads, we have families, I absolutely believe that we should have a home for our family, a kind of place where we anchor them, so give them this safe place to call home. I believe that fundamentally, and I want to be in a position to do that for my family too. But I also think it's really, really, really important for each person to assess their context. So for those of you listening to this, you really need to obviously have your budget dialed in. You need to have your emergency fund in place before you decide, hey, I want to own a home, or hey, I want to own some kind of high value asset or thing, right? And so, super, super, super important. I'll give you a little bit of context. Here in the UAE, we, in most cases, live in opulence, but there's also a really dark side to it. So the UAE, most people know it as Dubai, but Dubai is just one city in the UAE, and that's where I live right now. But the UAE is obviously made up of 7 different emirates, and you could say about 5% of the population, 5% of the entire country's population are the local citizens. They call them Emiratis, and the government here.
So 5%.
Yeah, I think it's about 5%.
Wow.
It might be 10%, but it's not more than 10%.
Okay.
And so that's the main population. That's the local citizens. Everyone else who lives here and works here are expats. And so those are people coming from other countries and living here and working here, but they can never become citizens. And so what we notice is that the government is obviously pro-emiratization. They want their citizens to obviously grow and live on for many generations and not obviously be completely diluted, right? And so the best incentives are in place for locals, right? We call them the citizens, we call them locals. So the best incentives are in place, the highest salaries, the highest paying jobs, the lowest utilities, the best access to finance, the lowest interest rates on loans. Sometimes if people default on loans, they can even get forgiven. Government programs in place to incentivize people to build their own homes with land allocated to the local population. Expats can never get that. To give you an idea, if I wanted to go to the bank and get a loan, I might qualify for 1 to 2 million, but local might be 5-10 times that, even if they're earning the same salary as me.
Same, yeah.
And so because of that status quo here, you'll notice that lots of the local citizens, they have access to lots of money, lots of wealth. It's their country, so they drive around in really, really nice cars. They obviously live in the best, biggest houses that you can find here. And expats see this. And when expats come into the country, because they see this and they see other expats kind of obviously falling into the same trap, that trap is obviously the temptation of opulence. You'll see people getting really expensive cars, living in really, really expensive houses and apartments, way, way, way beyond their means. Emirates pilots, for example, are an I'm obviously not like dissing anybody here, but just from observation, that they are one example that kind of falls into this trap. They, obviously have access to some of the best perks for any kind of employment sector here. And they, of course, as a result, live in the best houses, have the best lifestyles, have some of the best cars, and obviously, their families are super well off. But last year, when we went on to lockdown, I think we laid off like 2,000 pilots. It's crazy, maybe more. And over like 30,000 people working in aviation. And lots of that opulence disappeared overnight. Lots of these pilots had to leave basically because the arrangement was, you can keep some of your benefits, but you don't get a salary until we can kind of normalize and go back to the original status. And so, what do these people do in that situation, right? Because they've most of them are in debt. Firstly, most of them have this incredibly lavish lifestyle. Brunches costing like hundreds of dollars per time. It's crazy. It's crazy, man. It's crazy. And, I just want to like use this forum, not to diss, but obviously to educate and make sure people are aware that we have to consider living within our means and building wealth over the long term instead of, wow, that looks really cool, I want to have that. Or that looks like something that's really awesome, they're having lots of fun, I want to have that. That's always the huge temptation here. I ended up getting like an AMG 6.3 liter Mercedes when I got here. And that was the worst freaking decision of my life. I kid you not. I kid you not. Worst decision of my life, because the power was awesome. I got lots of, obviously I got lots of speeding tickets. But number one, I bought the car at a certain value, was only able to sell it for half the value. But I also paid, you could say, half the value of the car in maintenance costs. And so I ended up paying almost 2 times the amount that I purchased the car off over time. So that was a huge cost, but it also put me in debt for like 5 years. Right. And so that's something that can wreck you. I'm so thankful and I'm so glad that, I obviously had a job that could sustain that. Obviously had some income from business that could sustain that. That's like one experience of debt, right? My other experience, and this kind of goes down the path of business and investing. And I always say this to people who are investors is, obviously it's something that's debatable, but only invest personally. This is my opinion. Only invest money that you can afford and are potentially willing to lose. And the reason I say that is because we never know what's going to happen with the markets. We never know. It's easy to say, it's easy for us to like look at our history, historical chart data and say, hey, the markets have been performing this way for, X amount of time, I'm going to get in, right? Obviously, that I'm a huge crypto investor, and I see so many people leveraging. So in other words, using debt to invest. And so I shared recently I think it was yesterday's episode on my live stream that, I started a business in 2016 here. It was a multi-million-dollar business. Very, very promising, very cool. I was renting out furniture, basically. It's nothing glamorous or anything like that, but it was just, it was really, really good business, making money from the first day, we opened. But I used a personal loan, not a business loan, a personal loan to finance that whole business. My plan and my arrogance at the time was, I could like pay this off in a couple months with all the income from the business. And it would have worked. It would have worked. But unfortunately, we had some trouble with the authorities here. And we were not allowed to trade until we got a permit from the government authority. Unfortunately, because of bureaucracy, you could say, that that permit never came for 1 whole year. We were waiting and waiting.
Wow.
And you obviously have to renew your license. And remember,
Right,
I'm using
right.
this personal loan to cover overheads, to cover to pay my employees. I had employees, and of course, I hired expats. And it was the most devastating experience for me, because after 1 year, we had to liquidate because we could no longer afford,
Wow.
because we were not allowed to trade. But we had a
Yeah.
really good business, really great business model. We had all this inventory, and it was just sitting there, not allowed. And so that's my point, right? You never know what's going to happen, and
Right.
and the bank doesn't care. The bank doesn't care that you can't trade. The bank doesn't care that you can't that you don't have a permit or whatever it is. The bank just wants you to make those payments. And for 4 freaking years, I made those payments on a business loan. We're talking like over 200K, right? And thank God I'm completely debt free now. But that's just like a real glimpse about how debt can completely ruin you if you over leverage.
Right.
And so that's just from my personal experience.
That's a lot, man. That's really good insight.
I just I really want people to who are listening to this, and we'll go over some of the content that you've written here, because I think it's really, really valuable. But I just want people to realize that there's definitely a good side to debt, with a credit record, with obviously building credit over time. You have access to all this funding, which you can use for physical assets. But then there's a very, very dark side to it, and many people don't take this into consideration. But anyways, let's be positive. Let's talk about.
There you go. Yeah, that's true.
Let's talk about. Let's talk about some constructive things that you wrote about here. So, for example, you referenced Dave Ramsey a lot. Do you want to just kind of walk us through some of that content there that you've written?
Yeah, he's one of the biggest names when you look at management strategies to take down your debt and to really pay off your debt. He's one of the ones that pops up into people's minds the best, and he's got a really good way of handling debt. I don't think he originally authored the strategy, but he's one of the ones that's been most effective in putting it out, and it's called the debt snowball. And how it works basically is you take so the first thing always, like we talked about in our last episode, is to sit down and do a budget and figure out how much discretionary income you have. Discretionary meaning what you can afford to put toward your financial goals. And you would take that amount, and this is just considering our debt position, not in conjunction with your emergency fund, which we went over already, but you would take that amount and you would basically pay the minimums on all your accounts except for one of your accounts that's your priority account. And then you would basically pay that, just hammer it as much as you can. If you have extra money throughout the month, you pay your priority account. And then once you've paid off that priority account, you take the amount you were putting toward that and you snowball it down to the next one. And it creates that's why it's called the debt snowball. It creates a snowball effect because those payments gradually increase on the other debt forms, and eventually you're debt free. So the best way that I recommend.
So sorry to interject. So for those listeners who might not understand some of that terminology, are we saying that we're going to increase our debt repayments slowly in each debt category? Is that what the snowball strategy refers to?
So it basically means that if you're taking a set amount, let's say you figured out you have $500 a month to put toward your debt. You have, 10 accounts, each of which has a minimum payment of $25, right? So that's $250. You would pay 9 of those, you'd pay the minimum payment. So you'd pay the minimum payment of $25 to 9 of those accounts. The remaining amount from that 500, you would throw at your priority account until that's paid off. And then once that's paid off, you'd go to the next one down on the list and you'd put that amount toward that in addition to the 25 that you were putting toward that minimum payment, and it creates kind of a snowball effect as you go on down the list.
Gotcha. So I'm guessing that your priority account, you're trying to completely flatten and remove that debt before you move on to the next account.
Yes. So Dave Ramsey usually recommends ordering your debts by smallest to largest, and his variable is, and his thinking is, and there's a lot of value to it for certain types of people that need to pay down debt. His strategy is basically saying that if you get some quick wins, meaning if you pay down some of these smaller balances, you start to see these accounts, go into zero balances. It provides psychological momentum. Yep. I kind of switch it up. I always think it's more valuable to arrange your debt sources by interest rate so that you have your highest priority set at your highest interest rate. So if you have, a variance of interest rates from 27% down to, 8%, you want to hit that 27% interest rate first, knock that out because you're going to pay less interest over the life of the loan. Then you work your way down the list. So you can make your list however you like. You can start with the Dave Ramsey approach and get some of those quick wins and build some psychological momentum. What I always recommend doing though is just ordering by interest rate and knocking out the highest interest rates first, and then snowballing down as you go down, because you're paying less interest rate, or you're paying less in interest rates over the life of the loan as you do that. So
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, that totally makes sense. I appreciate you kind of explaining that there. Okay, so
this is actually a strategy that my wife and I use to pay off our debts, and it worked well for us. So,
do you want to give like
an personal experience? So the debt that I mentioned earlier, I had about $15,000 of credit card debt out of my 20s coming out. We paid that down. That was near the top of our list, paying that down. We had a small amount left in student loans. We've had some car loans over the years as well. Those are all completely paid off. But we kind of prioritized our choices there by our interest rates and how much value there was to paying off that particular source of debt. So it worked well for us, and we're down to just our mortgage now. We've paid everything down to just our mortgage, and that's where we stand right now. So it's worked well for us. We had some various sources of debt, and the variance in interest rates was pretty wide, but it worked well for us doing it that way.
Yeah, congratulations on paying that. Yeah, super liberating.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple questions there. So I suppose the first question is, and this is kind of like a little bit of life advice too. Like, okay, so do you disclose before you're about to marry somebody? Do you disclose the debt, or do you like just discover it afterwards?
Yeah, no, I did for sure. So we don't have any secrets between the two of us. So it's good.
Gotcha. The second one is more important. The second one, I would like to get your thoughts on student loan and student debt. I know this is, like, especially in the US context, it's one of the biggest debt sources out there right now, the trillions. What's your take? What's your perspective? How do you feel about this?
I think for a lot of people, it's kind of a necessity, honestly. If they're going for a college education, you're going to be looking at, number one, scholarships or any kind of programs like that might help reduce the cost to you. But I think for a lot of people, closing the gap between what they're responsible for and what they can get through programs like that means taking on some student loan debt. I think it's a reality for a lot of people, and I think it's something that needs to be figured into your financial plan. But generally speaking, student loan interest is below that 5% cutoff that I usually consider high interest rate. So I think it's workable into your financial plan for sure. But I think for a lot of people, it's just kind of a necessity,
Gotcha.
If you're going for that higher education.
Gotcha. And this is like common in the United States, right? Correct?
Student loan debt?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Because I never had student loan debt, but I know like lots of people in South Africa did experience that too. Are you able to like quantify, like, say, an average cost per year or throughout the life of a degree? What would that be like? I know it obviously varies from college to college, but...
Yeah, I'd have to do some research on that to give you a knowledgeable answer. I don't really know off the top of my head.
Yeah. When I was, after I'd graduated university and I wanted to pursue, postgraduate studies in the United States, UCLA, New York University, specifically in filmmaking, I was looking at, I was looking at like over $150,000 just for a master's degree. And this was after...
It gets up there.
Yeah, this was after I had already, done like 2 undergraduate degrees, right? And I think, both of my undergraduate degrees in South Africa, I mean, they weren't like the best, right? It was very academic and, definitely could be better. But I had to like quantify that today. Let me just do some math here really quickly. I would say for all 4 years of my university undergraduate program, and this is obviously excluding living expenses, but just for like, the university costs, I would say I probably spent around $7,700.
Wow.
And so, obviously, I could pay for some of it with scholarships, but I could also pay for it with income from, working like side jobs or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's my next question. Could that be an option for people who are in the United States to look at programs overseas where it's considerably cheaper than being stuck to, the United States alone?
For college?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I don't know what that would look like as far as the application process, getting in. I know I'm familiar with what it is here in the United States, but crossing the boundaries, the borders, I'm not really sure what that would look like. I think it's definitely something that people have done, but I'm not sure how easy of a process it is,
Yeah, for sure. I know that it's from my experience, and I also studied in Japan, and I think it's a lot easier for a U.S. citizen to study abroad than it is for an expat to come to the U.S. I know that's definitely, from my experience, a lot easier for people to do. So if you are a student, and we're not saying do this, but I'm saying, if you're a student, if you're somebody who's just starting out and you're asking yourself, hey, I want to go study, higher education, consider the cost factor over time, right? Like for
absolutely.
me, just looking at a top tier master's program for me was looking at over $150,000. If I wanted to do an MBA, at like the Ivy League level, easily over 200K. That's assuming I got in, right? Because it's so competitive.
Right.
Now, you could get high quality education overseas for a fraction of the cost, a fraction if you're a citizen of the United States. I
believe it.
Yeah. And so, definitely explore your options, guys. Don't settle and sign on that dotted line because you think that's your only option. There are many opportunities out there. And, I've been in education. I've been an educator for 11 years now. And so I definitely have a perspective, on the traditional education system. You definitely get what you pay for, but you also are not guaranteed to get anything remotely close to the opportunity that you're potentially pursuing with your degree, because of this competitive, crazy, ever-changing landscape. And so that's one of the reasons why we're addressing the concept of investing, becoming debt-free, budgeting, financial management, because the world is changing. The financial world is changing, and it's changing before our very eyes, and it's so rapid, and it's the
very fact that cryptocurrency is a thing is testament to that.
Absolutely. And let's just say that some of the jobs that you might be studying for right now at this very moment might not exist in the next decade, the next 2 decades. And so, as a hedge against that kind of risk, you want to also consider thinking about the long-term impact of that debt, which you might be carrying for that long, as well as the potential for career change along the way. And so, like, for example, I studied filmmaking. I'm not a filmmaker. I mean, I wish I could be. Working on the newest Star Wars productions, like The Mandalorian, all these other TV shows that are coming out. But I'm not. I'm not. And I wish I could be, but I'm not. And that's the reality of studying a higher degree. I think you might also have similar experience, Sean. Like, sometimes it doesn't work out. You go.
No, I mean, I got a degree in writing.
Yeah.
And I guess my plan was always to pursue a career in writing, but also maybe as a fallback to end up teaching it. And yeah, I got out of college. I ended up working at a hotel for about 5 years and then joined up at the fire department. So yeah, it's been a convoluted career path. It's not always what you plan out, but I also think there's some unrealistic expectations people have of plotting out your entire trajectory of life at the age of 18. Like I think back to where I was at 18, I'm a fundamentally different person than I was at the age of 18, and I think expecting me to figure out exactly what I was going to do for the rest of my life at that age is just, for me, it was ridiculous. Right. Sure. So, I mean, there's people out there that they know what they're going to do. They have that vision, and they pursue it, and they're like a bulldog. They get their teeth in it, and that's it, but that wasn't me for sure. So
absolutely. But here you are now, man. You were the co-host of Firegrinders, the world's best podcast on financial investing.
That's right.
But I think in the end, and this, it's probably just a general point, things tend to go full circle if you stay true to yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And so I actually had no idea you had a degree in writing until like the first episode, and so.
Oh, really?
Yeah, man. Yeah, I had no idea. Wow. And so I think that that skill is incredibly valuable in the marketplace right now. It's just a different marketplace, and I'm really excited to pursue, this project, this business venture together over the years and see how we can put all our skills together, even the ones we studied.
Me too.
For. Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely feel like that's my strongest form of expression, is through writing. So I have always valued it, even though I didn't end up pursuing a career right out the gates in writing per se. I've always thought it was a useful skill in certain ways. And I'm sure you could say the same for what you studied. You know what I mean? You're not working on the Mandalorian per se, but I'm sure it's added a lot of perspective to your ventures, So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the production right now that we're doing, definitely.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, this is one example of that for sure.
Yeah. So things definitely go full circle. Let's just speaking of going full circle, let's circle back to how we can summarize this whole debt position. On your post here, you say putting it all together. Do you want to just kind of summarize how people can like tackle this from based on everything that we've shared?
So yeah, the section you're referring to was putting everything in perspective for the two topics we've talked about for these last two episodes, meaning your emergency fund and your debt position. Okay, so let's say you have both issues. You don't just need to build an emergency fund. You don't need to just tackle debt. You have both of those things that you need to take care of at once. The way that I generally recommend doing it is to start by paying the minimums of your debt sources while building your first month's emergency fund. So if your emergency fund, if you know your month's expenses, let's say are $3,000, for example, the first thing you're going to do is your goal is to build that $3,000 and build 1 month's worth of emergency expenses. While you're doing that, you're paying your minimums on your debt sources, so you're not defaulting on anything. And then once you have that established, you're going to start using the debt snowball strategy we laid out earlier to tackle your debt sources. If at any point while you're doing that, you need to dip into your emergency fund, if you have a car repair come up that's $1,000, go back to the first phase. Go back to paying your minimums on your debt sources and replenish your emergency fund back up to that 1 month's expenses. And then go back to the debt phase, pay down your debt. Using the debt snowball strategy we outlined earlier. Once you've paid down all of your high interest debt sources, go back and finish out your emergency fund, meaning 3 to 6 months expenses, whatever you've kind of laid out as your goal for your emergency fund. And then once you've done that, once you don't have any more high interest debt, you've got a fully funded emergency fund, you are ready to invest and you're ready to follow where we're going to go from here. So
that's really
those are the
exciting.
two things that those are the two things that we think are the best considerations for starting out. You need to have those two things in order before you're truly ready to invest. And I think if you've done those two things and you've got them all lined up, you've got a solid foundation to launch from.
Absolutely. And we're really excited to unpack that in the next episode. So, by the way, if you have not yet checked out fightfirewithfire.net, you'll find the link to that in the show notes or the description area. Make sure you check that out, subscribe so that you don't miss any future content. Definitely subscribe to this podcast, share this podcast, rate this podcast so we know how we're doing. And that way we can continue to bring you really valuable information. We'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section. If you're viewing this on YouTube or Facebook, let us know there. Or if you are viewing or you're obviously hearing this over like iTunes or Spotify or something like that, if there's a way for you to let us know in the review section, please do so at least we know how we're doing. You have been listening to Firegrinders, and it is our pleasure. It is our pleasure to have spent this time with you, Sean. I want to thank you so much, my friend. I know it's really late over there, and
it's all good.
Yeah.
It's been fun.
Yeah, it really has. It really, really has, and we're really looking forward to building out this project to bring you guys the best value possible completely for free. And so definitely hope that you would consider following us on this journey by liking, subscribing, and sharing the content. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.